Hey, it's the Cycle World Podcast. I'm Mark Hoyer, the editor-in-chief. Kevin Cameron's with me, our technical editor. Our topic this week is what if the two-stroke had survived? What if we could have road-going two-strokes that met emissions and made all the power in the world? I was thinking, Kevin, about 500cc Grand Prix bikes. You were talking about 125s that made 60 horsepower at the end of that class. 60 horsepower out of a single cylinder, 120, close to it, 125cc engine that weighed mere pounds. And I thought about, the heyday of 500s when they weighed 286 pounds and they were
even less sometimes before the limit was imposed.
Yeah.
By the timid gentleman.
Yes, but a limit of 286 pounds, and they were making we'll call it 230, 240. I mean, imagine, and we, kind of pipey, pretty broad power at the end. They were working on it,
Yes, they certainly were. Several technologies.
Better than 1990 when everybody was getting spit off and.
Oh, yeah. 1990 was the beginning of the controls. And the first thing they did was they imposed torque limits in lower gears so that you wouldn't have the full spectrum from 0 to 190 horsepower in a quarter-turn throttle.
Yeah.
There's some excitement for you.
Yeah, so that was racing, though. That was racing, and we are singing the benefits of an organ that plays one note, maybe two, right?
Yes.
The expansion chamber doing its thing. But two-stroke street bikes, we had the RZ 350. That was the last thing that we could get of any note in the United States. And a good running RZ, particularly once, they made it pass, and it ran pretty well. They had catalyzers in the chambers, and
hot ones.
Hot ones. People noticed the heat, but it ran okay. And everybody was kind of tearing that stuff off and throwing on your Tommy Crawfords or your Toomeys or you name it. Just put somebody's name on a big sausage and bolt it onto your two-stroke and start doing premix, and away you went. And they were making tons of power. Those 350s, man, they ran great. They were a great street bike, and they were
so easy to get more.
Yeah, really.
That was
light.
the great thing about the two-stroke from the very beginning was that if you had some clue what you were doing, what two-strokes wanted, you just could make yourself feel like a wizard. It was crazy.
Yeah.
And of course, it was intoxicating. We loved it.
Yeah. And, but what we wanted to talk about, there was as emissions were coming around and as manufacturers were looking for emissions regulations were coming around, and as manufacturers were looking for ways to make a lighter, faster, better operating, more efficient car or motorcycle, there was a ton of research done into two-strokes, and there were some new technologies that came around. We'll talk about orbital, all that. There's direct injection. We're getting port injection from KTM and the transfer ports and oiling. But, two-strokes we should talk about, I guess, the host of difficulties that make a conventional two-stroke so hard to get through any emissions.
Yes.
Sniffing it all, and then strategies to fix this. And
well, here it goes. The piston is sliding down the cylinder and the pressure is falling because work is being done on the crankshaft, so the combustion gas is losing energy, losing pressure, temperature is dropping, and now the piston edge begins to uncover the exhaust port, and what the Germans call Auspuff.
Auspuff.
I love to say that. Auspuff. It begins. And in a few degrees, somewhere between 20 and 35 degrees, the pressure in the cylinder is low enough that we could think about blowing in fresh charge. Well, first early two-strokes were made to be cheap, made to be simple, sell at a low price. And when the FIM admitted two-strokes on an equal displacement basis in 1949, the reason they did so was because These simple engines use the crankcase, the motion of the underside of the piston. They use the crankcase as the scavenge pump. So when the piston goes up, a port opens, air enters the carburetor, picks up fuel. So the crankcase has air-fuel mixture in it. Piston comes back down, closes off the inlet port, the pressure in the crankcase rises, and meanwhile, auspuff is taking place, and the transfer port's open. Now, you get this sudden inrush. What's inrushing is mixture, fuel and air together. And the exhaust port is open. So on the deflector piston engines that we talked about earlier, a lot of early chainsaw motors and outboard motors had a deflector, a fence on the piston, so that when the fresh charge came in and hit that, it made a loop around the cylinder before it reached the exhaust port. So that increased the trapping efficiency, the amount of charge that remained in the cylinder when the exhaust port shut. And Adolf Schmerle made the flat top two-stroke concept. He had a transfer port on either side of the exhaust pointed away from the exhaust, so that directed a stream that made that same loop. But inevitably, with fresh charge rubbing on cooled combustion gas, inert combustion product, there's mixing. When you move a teaspoon back and forth in a cup of coffee with cream, you can see the little vortices at the edges of the spoon. That's the mixing zone. And so,
well, when you pour it in, it's just like mixture going into a cylinder. If you pour
it sure
cream
is.
in,
It makes that same loop.
Makes that rolling.
I always think of that when I pour cream into coffee. In fact, I wish I were doing it now.
You're special. That's why.
Anyway,
you have visions no one else has.
Anyway, no, I know there's a lot of two-stroke guys that feel this way. I mean, they have the same view. During this process, the only way a two-stroke can work is to put the four necessary functions into two strokes, which means a couple of them have to be happening at the same time. So the exhaust port is open, and we're trying to fill the cylinder. We're losing 30 or more % of the fresh charge out the exhaust port. And that's why if you have a really good running two-stroke, it uses its specific fuel consumption is 0.65 or in that range, whereas a four-stroke is like 0.5. And that is built in. People have tried aiming the ports in all different ways, and probably they've used divining rods and consulted psychics. But that charge loss is the big problem for two-strokes because it just comes smoking out of there, and it smells like gasoline and maybe castor oil, and two-stroke people love that. But the EPA is the sworn enemy of corrupt air. So they have no choice but to say, no way, guys, you can't run this. So people hit upon the idea of scavenging with pure air and adding the fuel after the exhaust port has closed. Now, a Swedish fellow named Hesselman developed, back in the 1920s, I think, a kind of semi-diesel gasoline burner that injected fuel during the compression stroke. And this is exactly what has had to happen with the Orbital Engine Company solution and the Ficht injector, is that they both spray into the combustion chamber after the exhaust port has closed. Every time you solve a problem, it improves your view, and as you look forward, you see another problem holding you back. And in this case, that problem is that the exhaust port closes around 90 degrees before top center, and ignition is going to occur somewhere between 30 and 15 degrees before top center. So it's a very short time for those fuel droplets to evaporate. And for that reason, special methods had to be developed to inject fuel in such a way that tiny droplets, hopefully around 10 microns, a micron is 1/1,000,000th of a meter, 10 micron droplets burn almost the same as completely evaporated fuel. So you need this trick injector to produce these tiny droplets that can evaporate before the spark comes, because droplets can't burn. There's no air in the droplet. So the orbital system was very clever. It had a pre-chamber, and the spray fuel in there, and then a little poppet valve opens, and the chamber is connected to the main combustion space by a small orifice. That air entering the pre-chamber causes a speed of sound to be reached in that nozzle, in that orifice, and that breaks up fuel droplets like crazy. And I once wrote a TDC about picking through books that I have here. That there's a book by Ludwig Prandtl, who was one of the big aerodynamicists at the early part of the 20th century, and he has a little formula for the droplet size resulting from entering an airstream at various speeds.
Ooh.
And you work through that, and if you have the speed of sound, you have 10 micron droplets. So that was one possibility, but it requires an air compressor to supply air for the little poppet valve that reaches the speed of sound in the orifice. You have to have this pre-chamber. That is, you can't just drill a hole in your cylinder head, thread it, and screw something in. For that kind of injector, the FICT, F-I-C-H-T, I think it was invented in Austria or overseas in any case, and it has a powerful solenoid in it so that it just pounds the fuel through a nozzle and breaks it down to about 40 microns. Now, at the time this work was going on, late 80s, a normal Napa fuel injector that you buy down at the store, the size of droplets in that coming from that are 50 to 150. And that didn't work. They didn't evaporate by the time the spark occurred. The orbital system was bought by Mercury Marine. Detroit auto manufacturers bought orbital licenses because in the late 80s, I counted 26 automobile companies that were investigating two-stroke engines because they were 40% less bulky, more powerful for their weight, and in one respect, they were outstanding in low emissions of nitrogen oxides. And the reason is that every two-stroke has natural EGR. EGR is exhaust gas recirculation, which means that exhaust gas from the previous cycle is preventing the combustion of the next cycle from reaching the 2600 degree Fahrenheit threshold of nitrogen oxide formation. So, and nitrogen oxides are the hardest to clean up. So the automakers
that's
were
why
interested in that. Yeah.
Well, in the 1970s, the Ford 460 cubic inch V8, pretty nice motor. In 68, it had 10-to-1 compression, and by I think 72 was a single year. It was terrible, low compression. They had huge dog dishes in the tops of the pistons. The 79 Lincoln Town Car, I think, was rated at 160 or 180 horsepower out of a 460 cubic inch V8.
Yes.
And they were working with carburetors and vacuum, and
They wanted to reduce the compression ratio so that the flame temperature would not create a lot of nitrogen oxides.
Right. And so they found, by the 80s, I use this because I have a 460 and I've read about it, but they have an 8.8 to 1 in the injected motors in like the 89. It's roughly 8.8 to 1. And they were able to bring the compression back with, using an EGR system and EFI. And so they're running that inert gas into the chamber at part throttle to essentially lower the compression when you don't need all the power.
Yeah.
It's inert. It's already been burned. They're taking it from way down the exhaust system, so it's relatively cool by the time it gets up to the intake. And then when you mash it, EGR turns off and you get all the 8.8 to 1 you want, and you're pulling your trailer and it works great. And then you go part throttle and you get pretty good mileage and so forth. So it's not the worst thing ever.
No. Now here's the crisis that faced the two-stroke makers, namely Yamaha, Suzuki, and Kawasaki. Their engineers knew all about Hesselmann engines. They knew that in 1973, the French firm Motobecan, which produced the Mobilette, moped, millions built.
Oh yeah, had one.
Yeah.
And a Puch.
They built a 350 Kawasaki, basically. It was an inline triple, looked a lot like the Kawasaki, and they gave it this direct injection system that injected fuel after the exhaust ports had closed. And they didn't get it working to anyone's satisfaction, but it was an important effort because someone had said, let's try this on a motorcycle two-stroke. And you can bet that there were a lot of dynos humming through the night with prototype this and prototype that. Certainly the auto manufacturers were doing it. But here's the problem. The auto manufacturers have billions of dollars from which to draw R&D budgets to meet emissions. Many fewer motorcycles are sold, and their selling price is lower, in general, than that of cars. So in an R&D war, it is the automotive side that is going to come up with a solution first, if at all. So the motorcycle companies sort of looked at they pulled their pockets inside out. Here's our R&D budget.
Yeah.
Do you think we're going to spend all of this on a gamble that we can solve direct injection emissions problems? No way. What we're going to do is we're going to go to the Napa store and we're going to buy the solutions that the automobile industries all over the world have already created. And that's why the two-stroke, after 1984 in the U.S., ceased to exist as a new vehicle on the highways. You could go on riding your two-stroke because it was a legal vehicle. It had been approved. But two-strokes in general did not go forward from that point. Yamaha tried on the RD350, the RZ350, catalytic converters, which basically meant that 30% of the fuel was being burnt just under your feet.
Gets pretty hot. They did.
Yep.
They sold those in 85 as well. So our last glorious year was 85.
And nobody wanted to know how it would feel to crash and tumble along and have the motorcycle end up across the back of your legs, for example. So that was the end of that. And the automotive manufacturers gave up their two-stroke research around 1990 because they came basically to the same conclusion. Safety in numbers. We'll stay together. We'll use the same solutions. And the EPA will regard that as, they're doing all they can. This is what results from it. And, of course, same thing. We have Euro 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth. So, yet there has always been interest in what if we could develop the orbital system, the fixed system, some other system, such that we could inject the fuel either after the exhaust port has closed or into a part of the transfer streams that can't reach the exhaust port by the time it closes. This is something that KTM and Bombardier, I think, have explored. They call it indirect fuel injection.
Giving it time to atomize the fuel. So it's injected.
Giving more time.
And
therefore requiring a less exotic and therefore less expensive injector.
So if you look at high performance, like there was a period of time in World Superbike where Ducati was running their V-twins, and we were seeing photographs of these spectacular injector systems. And so there was an injector down by the valve that would run up to a certain RPM, and then they would turn on the shower head, and the trumpet would be sitting there, and the shower head was
hovering over
inches. Yes. And the reason was that at extremely high RPM, they wanted to inject the fuel farther away from the chamber to give it more time to mix up. Yep. And we all think of this stuff as happening instantly, but it doesn't happen instantly. Everything takes a little bit of time, just like you were talking about. You have a very narrow window between the exhaust port closing and when you have to light the spark to get enough combustion pressure when the crank is turned to be in the happy place to take the best advantage of that pressure rise. And these things take time. So injecting the fuel indirectly, like into a transfer port where the velocity is very high.
Very similar to a shower head in concept.
Yep. And it's farther away from when it's needing to be lit.
Yep.
And so there's time for it to kind of like mix up. It's like if you just pour the cream in the coffee, eventually it will. But if you get a spoon in there and you mix it up, homogeneous charge.
Yes. So there were the people who have a lot of experience running either direct or indirect injection engines. The crankcase temperature rises because there's no longer fuel evaporating in there. And as you know, a drop of alcohol on your palm to banish the deadly COVID virus is a cooling effect. And already Honda in their last NSR 500s had begun water cooling the crankcase, not because they were using direct injection, but because the hotter the crankcase runs, the lower the density of the air and fuel that enter the cylinder. If the crankcase is cooler, you get a denser charge and therefore more power. So there I was in the Motegi Museum looking at this thing with a stupid look on my face, and I'm thinking, oh, it has water-cooled crankcase. So that's one thing that would have to be considered. Another thing to consider, if we created a future two-stroke with magic injection, how do we lubricate the bottom end and not have that lubricant appear as an unacceptable unburned hydrocarbon in the exhaust?
So for anybody, kids, if you've never done premix or you haven't poured oil in an injection tank, a two-stroke relies on air, fuel, and oil mixed together. And
passing through the crankcase.
So, when the piston comes down in the cylinder, it's making a vacuum in the cylinder, and that's how we're getting air, fuel into the cylinder. But as the piston's moving down in the crankcase, you have to think of the opposite effect. It is pressurizing.
Pressure's rising, yes.
Because the piston is moving down, and that's what's pushing the mixture through the transfer ports, which are up the sides of the cylinders and blowing in. And so the piston goes down and it's pushed all the mixture in, and now it's coming back up and it's going to cover the exhaust port and it's going to squeeze and pop. You're going to light that fire and go bang, and it's going to make your popcorn sound. And as the piston is coming up to close the exhaust port and make compression, it's making a vacuum in the crankcase now. And so however it is, whether it's a disc valve or a reed valve, something is allowing the air fuel to get into the crankcase. And when
It
you
won't let it blow back out.
and won't let it. So the reed valve is a check valve, little flaps on it, and it would keep the stuff from coming back out the carburetor as the transfers were transferring into the chamber. And that's where the oil was. You put oil in your gas and it lubricated the bottom end, all your little needles.
Because the bottom end is all rolling element bearings.
Doesn't
which
need pressure.
need very little. They need very little oil, whereas a plain bearing, such as the journal bearings in automobile and motorcycle engines of modern times, requires pumped, filtered, cooled lubricant.
Because it rides on a wedge, folks.
Yes.
And you know what happens? Like, that's the Asperities podcast, Kevin, is where.
Yes, it sure is.
So
got to keep that wedge tall enough so that it's off the Asperities. So that oil that is mixed with the fuel to lubricate the bottom end goes out through the exhaust port, or it gets burned, or it gets partly burned. Under those conditions, the people up in Ann Arbor, the EPA, are going to detect it as unburned hydrocarbons. And the unburned hydrocarbon levels keep being reduced, of course, because they couldn't clean up automobile exhaust overnight. It's taken years. And they just want to keep cities from turning into the... I stood, in 1971, I stood in the paddock area at Ontario Motor Speedway and looked straight up, and I saw these long, slow-moving fingers of greenish gas. So people who think that auto emissions, it's all a hoax. It's fomented by those dirty greens.
I'll tell you what,
they're mean.
I grew up in California, Southern California, and my dad was a private pilot, and we were flying back at dusk. We were coming back into our local airport, which was Fullerton, in a Cessna Turbo 210, T210 retractable gear. And we're descending at sunset, and we're going through layers of different colored gases. I'm looking out, and I'm seeing, oh, there's purple. There's something that looks sulfury, kind of a sickly looking yellow.
A sickly yellow, yes.
And we're coming down, and that's how it was in 1978. And we would have times where we couldn't have recess outside because of smog alerts. And so it's really it's been game changing, the ability to keep the tailpipe stuff clean. We drive zillions of more miles. The population has probably doubled since then, and the air is significantly cleaner. So we appreciate all the efforts, although we still like putting a pipe on something. Going racing, just having pure,
Here's an example. In 1995, Euro 1, the limit for unburned hydrocarbons was 3 grams per kilometer. A gram is small. And this year, Euro 5 plus, it's down to 1/10 of a gram.
Wow.
So 30 times. It's 1/30th now of what it used to be. So you can be sure that lubricating the crankcase by squirting oil into the bearings with tiny metering pump is going to be detected in Ann Arbor, and they're not going to allow it. So
even
how do we lubricate?
Even with the great oils that we have, because back in, when I was a kid, you put 2-stroke oil on something, what did you get? Big plumes of mosquito fog, like big white plumes of smoke, and you almost couldn't get rid of it. And then they started getting all these synthetics, and they designed these oils that would come out really clean. You didn't have the big trail of smoke, but they're still there. Just because you can't see them doesn't mean it's not there.
Yes. So how do we get rid of that? Well, there's no rule that says that a 2-stroke has to receive its air from the crankcase operating as a pump. For example, the 71 series Detroit diesel truck engines had those big roots blowers on the side of them, which were such a big number in drag racing for years and years.
Famous 671 blower.
671 blower, that's right. It meant 6 cylinders of 71 cubic inches each. And that blower was driven by the engine. Okay, we can do that with a two-stroke. We can have a separate blower. We could have an electric blower, as Honda showed at the recent EICMA show. We could have a centrifugal blower. We could have all kinds of blowers. DKW had a piston blower for a time in the late 1930s. It was much bigger than the power piston, this big old puffing away. So if we supply the scavenge air from a separate blower, then the crankcase doesn't have to have fuel going through it. That means we can have a four-stroke style crankcase that is lubricated by pumped recirculating oil. So when Ford was researching possible two-stroke, compact two-strokes for little cars of the future, one of the problems they identified was rusting of the crankshaft bearings during long periods of storage. Oh, I'm flying to Europe. I'm going to leave my car in the parking structure for 2 months.
Yeah, opening up a vintage two-stroke, man, it's a gamble. You don't know what you're
Sometimes there's a water line in there on the flywheels.
Oh, man.
I don't know what people have done. Anyway.
I'm sure that's what happened to my RD 350's bearings, because it came out of the Bay Area. And I'm sure that once I got it running, I was running on rust.
Yeah.
And it ran along pretty good for a while, and then it started making choo-choo sounds. And if you've never heard the sound of bearings going out, it's sort of I don't know, it's a maracas meat train sound. It's
sometimes there's a little squealing too if there's cages breaking up. So imagine a future two-stroke that has a trouble-free bottom end. No more none of this stuff about, oh, I got 850 miles on the crank, I'm going to have to change it, which we did all the time in racing. Instead, what they say today is pull any engine lately deposited in the junkyard, and you'll find that the bottom end is no problem. The failure that caused that car to be junked is somewhere else. So
it's in the transmission.
This is a rugged, long-lasting bottom end with a two-stroke top end. And there's no need for a biconical expansion chamber or tuned pipe, because now we're moving air with an external blower. So we don't need the combination of the crankcase as a pump and the exhaust pipe as an acoustic supercharger, which are cooperating to move air into the cylinder. So what is the power band going to be like? If we no longer have the one-note samba exhaust pipe, our notional future two-stroke is going to pull like a 671 diesel. It's going to have torque everywhere because we're blowing the air into it. We're injecting the fuel. We don't have to turn it at a tremendous speed because the thing is going to develop some pressure. Toyota prototyped a two-stroke, six-cylinder pickup truck engine, and it outpulled V8s like crazy because V8 has 4 power strokes per revolution. The two-stroke 6 has 6. And it was abandoned. But the way it worked was it had valves in the head, and I think it had cylinder ports down near bottom center, but maybe not. I'm not sure about that. But at any rate, they had developed this thing to a considerable level where it performed well. And a modern two-stroke for a motorcycle would likewise perform well. It would be a torque monster. I remember talking with an old gentleman who had recently restored an ancient Indian, and he wasn't accustomed. He was a modern motorcyclist. He rode modern bikes. He wasn't accustomed to a Volkswagen or Harley Davidson like cam timings, which basically open and close at top center, bottom center. Tremendous torque at the bottom. So he said, I'm riding this thing around the yard, and I began to fall over, and I took a handful because that's what your reflex tells you to do with a modern bike. And he said, I just nearly came a cropper in a big way because it just started pulling like crazy from close to 0 RPM because its cylinder filling process was not dependent on keeping the intake valves open past bottom dead center or a lot of tuned exhaust header length and all this business. It was just a big old air pump. And that's what the engine we're discussing here would be like. But would it please those people who want Kevin Schwantz in some other reality to be winning races by doing wild and crazy things on a Suzuki 500 two-stroke? Probably not.
Probably not.
Because it may even be that in some future time the motorcycle will be at risk for its very existence, because you can be sure that in Brussels, in some agency there, they collect statistics on everything to do with motor vehicle fatalities, and the numbers aren't good. So that's why the industry works hard to give riders the best vehicle, the most easily controllable, most stable vehicle possible.
I wish the people in Brussels would measure the rewards of riding.
Yes, well, that's the difficulty with bureaucrats is they see the numbers and they act on that. That is their reality. They're not saying to themselves, "Yeah, but what about Kevin Schwantz
and
all the people who wanted to be him?"
Yeah, I guess that's when we dream about a street-going two-stroke, we think about having that, maybe getting a little bit more torque off the bottom, but having that that point where the everything resonates in harmony and things go crazy. You
on
get
the
that.
TZ 750, the torque doubled at 9,300, and that's why Mike Baldwin said, ride it in the linear range. That is, never let the tack needle drop below 9,300, because then to get back, you'll have to go through this steep torque rise.
Yeah.
That is just rubbing its little hands together. I'm going to put you in the gravel.
Well,
right now.
that's let's see. What'd you say about my RD 350? 7 to 9, I think, is what you said, or 7 to 10, 75 to 10, something like that. And offhandedly told me I'd have to replace the ignition because the
rotor was big and heavy.
The rotor's big and heavy, and it'll walk off when you spin it past the red line, the normal red line. So, yeah, great. That torque curve thing is interesting because we've talked about this before. Don Canet once told me I was riding a race prepped Hayabusa for Formula Extreme with a shortened chassis.
Yep.
Rad Greaves' bike, and I was riding it at Willow Springs, and it was completely overwhelming because it would come up in the power, and it's a Hayabusa engine, so it's pretty darn abundant, but this was pretty hopped up as well. So it was terrifying because it would just come on, Yep. And Don said, no. He says, run it a gear higher. And it was genius because it's on the downward slope of the torque curve at higher RPM.
Yeah.
And therefore it wasn't, as it was winding up, the torque was reducing. So it had plenty of torque. You're not going to go slower.
And you could keep up with it.
You were just lowering your risk. So having a torque curve double at 9,500 or within 2 RPM, as they do, where it just kind of goes, cut wood, as you like to say.
McDoohan was another one who said the same thing that Mike Baldwin did. He said, right at above the exhaust pipe threshold, so that you're in the linear zone where the torque is doesn't do anything crazy, doesn't suddenly jump up like a bill spike that comes up out of your chair. So these were top riders saying that these motors were not rideable unless you use special techniques. Now, that's fun to read about. It's the stuff of myth, but it's not good for going down the street for gummy bears because it commands your entire attention, and people
Which I
can't
try
ride
it,
that
at
way
certain times is
for
terribly
long.
it's terribly
Oh,
charming for short periods of time. But yeah,
oh, absolutely, yes. Well,
but
and good old Tolstoy, he said something like, uh, "Continuous happiness doesn't exist. We have to be satisfied with flashes of happiness, and we remember and treasure them." So, in a way, that two-stroke era that
but
some of us
why does
lived through,
suffering make the best stories though? Why?
because it's everyone's story.
Yeah, yeah, it's our universal commonality. You're right. So I would like to go back and inventory what we are talking about. So we have a two-stroke, the classic two-stroke, which is some roller bearings. It's pumping itself. We put a lightweight pipe on it, and we have a carburetor, and it's incredibly lightweight and terribly simple. So now we're trading. We are not lubricating by pouring oil in our gas. We're having a oil pump.
Yep.
And we're carrying quarts of oil. So there's a mechanical weight penalty there, a little bit more complexity. We're going to probably cool the crankcases liquidly, maybe. And then induction. Now, so the bottom end of the two-stroke is now like a four-stroke, and we're not having our oil issues. We're just pumping oil, and as we have,
No mixture in the crankcase. Yeah.
I've got a terrible, 2004 Chevy Colorado with the 5-cylinder in it, and the bottom end is oil tight, doesn't burn a drop. Oil pressure's great, like 205,000 miles, which is a miracle.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's great. So the bottom end is four-stroke essentially, and we've added complexity and weight. And then an induction, we need a supercharger. Could be electric. If you haven't seen the Honda electric supercharged V3 podcast, it's in the past. Go check it out. And we talked about all the things it could do, which are highly applicable here, because that's how I would want to do it, is electric. Like it's
the thing about this electric supercharger, you may recall if you've seen that video, is that the response time to the pressure you want is extremely small, because they've put this switched reluctance motor on there that can run to 80,000 RPM.
solid.
And it's no turbo lag, so to speak. So this device is eminently controllable because it is electrical. Electrical devices are controlled by little transistor switches, which are obeying commands from our fingers dancing on a keyboard or from sensors built into throttles. So this is all eminently doable.
All right, so how are we getting? Yeah, so we're going to add this motor, maybe a little electrical to supply the amps necessary to make that 80,000 RPM thing run the PSI that we need, which, probably
moderate, low pressure.
Probably 6 pounds would do it. And so 6 PSI. And then how are we getting the mixture in to the cylinder and sealing it off? How is that working?
Well, we can either carburate through the blower, before the blower.
Because that'll mix it up, right? That's what they did with aircraft engines on big radials, is they put it in and the supercharger mixed it all up.
In fact, at the end, they injected into a ring on the supercharger rotor that had little passages that went out to a part of the rotor while it's spinning that is just below the speed of sound, so that those fuel droplets coming out kind of went, oh, where am I? And were immediately broken into tiny particles. So yeah, that was good. Or we could inject the fuel. Um, there's so many options, but the problem is, does anyone have this as a goal? Will it make anybody money? Because things that don't make people money don't command a lot of R&D.
We're just talking about art, Kevin.
Okay, we'll talk about art. That's good.
The art of the two-stroke, the art of the future two-stroke. So, are we using reed valves? How's that working? How are we getting the air into the cylinder, and then we're having an exhaust port that we could use a power valve?
There's a trunk around the cylinders which is kept at scavenge air pressure. So when the transfer port's open, air rushes in from that trunk.
Got it.
And that's the way it worked on two-stroke diesels. So
so essentially, we're maintaining the transfers.
Yep. But they may be a ring of ports completely around the cylinder, and quite low, quite not sticking up too much from bottom center, because as you said, everything happens so fast.
Yep. So
Puff,
the piston,
the air enters the cylinder.
Okay, so we come up on compression. We've got fresh mixture. We come up on compression, and the dome, the combustion chamber could be the same as it is now, correct?
Well, we might want to put the exhaust valves up there.
Oh, okay. So we're not going to use an
And the
exhaust
great thing
port.
about that is, unlike the cylinder wall port of a two-stroke, which is open throughout the whole cylinder filling process, we can close mechanical exhaust valves and blow positive pressure into the cylinder through the transfers. We can puff it up.
Okay, so we have a combustion chamber, but it only really truly needs one valve to get the job done.
Whatever it needs to operate at the speed we need it to.
Yeah.
So I don't know what that would be at this point, but there have been engines with 4 exhaust valves in the head, and that might be one way to do it. Those huge marine diesels have the exhaust valves in the head, valve or valves, and a ring of fresh charge ports at bottom center that are supplied through a trunk that encircles the cylinders and is kept flowing by an external blower. And often in those big marine diesels, it's a turbo blower, because otherwise that energy in the exhaust would just be lost. This way it has been put to human purpose.
Yeah.
And they're doing that. They've done that in Formula One too. They've used turbos to drive generators during that sort of hybrid formula that they had for a while. So all these technologies have accumulated since 1985 that could be applied to a two-stroke motorcycle. And that's what we've been talking about is, what might that be like?
What I was hoping for was that we could I think one of the charming things about a two-stroke is the simplicity of the cylinder head.
Yeah.
Of a conventional two-stroke, because you can just make the dome whatever you want, and you can make your squish band. You don't have to fuss. You put your spark plug right in the middle.
Right in the middle.
And you make the squish band, around the edge of the cylinder where the piston comes really close to the head and squeezes in it, and it's just a perfect ring, and it just blows it all into the little kernel right around the spark plug in that little ball-shaped chamber. And
yeah, it's a wonderful for combustion. Because, for example, with any number of 4-stroke combustion chambers where the bore is greater than the stroke by, say, 1.3 to 1.6 times, we're needing to ignite the charge between 40 and 50 degrees before top dead center, which means the engineers call it time loss. It's time during which heat is being lost from the combustion gas by being conducted away in the metal of the engine. Whereas with the two-stroke, the ignition timing, when you're in the torque band, is something of the order of 15 degrees before top dead center, because there's nothing in the chamber. There are no valve cutouts. There are no fences or strange alpine structures on top of the pistons, so that the air is the master of all it surveys, and it whirls around in a mad dance that lights up very fast.
I was shocked when I got my first two-stroke and I was setting the ignition timing and I was reading up that it needed to be 10 or 12 or I'm like, wait a minute, that can't be right.
Yeah.
Because, you know, I've been working on four strokes and, you know, your typical okay chamber four strokes, 34 degrees. My Veloset, take a drink. My Veloset was 38. That's the factory. They want 38 degrees before top center. And that's that's a very classic 50s combustion chamber, big dome piston, valves canted out. Brian Slark of the Barber Motorcycle Museum sent me pictures of Ferrari racing pistons, and you wouldn't believe it. 90-degree valves, I'm sure of it, but the wedge on top of the piston is just this giant mountain, and then the valve cutouts are huge.
Yes,
and it's just it's so different. So you have to light that fire so far ahead because it's got all these impediments. The flame has to travel over the mountain,
it kills the air motion, because the thing about the two-stroke chamber is it has an open area in the center of the chamber where the air can just do that mad dance. Whereas in the four-stroke, it's like the pit and the pendulum where the walls come in.
Yeah, and then you've got the valves, which are changing the topography of the chamber because the valves have a certain contour that you're not going to really alter very much. So
you don't have that open chamber. You have a chamber that is a thin layer of mixture under pressure, and it has to spread over that whole layer. So good luck.
Well, that's what I was hoping we would maintain on my notional future two-stroke, was the perfect combustion chamber like that. But we got to put exhaust valves in, and we got to control them to keep. We can't,
so that we can supercharge.
So we can just blow it in there, and then then you have what you would kind of consider as that perfect linear torque, like we get out of an electric motor, where it's just rheostatic as much as you want, whenever you want it. Especially with the electric supercharger, just blowing it in there.
Especially with the electric supercharger.
Yeah, that's pretty good. So what do you think? Like a 500cc two-stroke, probably looking at, we kind of make whatever power we want, can't we? If we're supercharging, you just say like, let's say 300.
Just up to the detonation limit.
Yep. But an easy 500cc, I mean, we'd easily be able to make 200 horsepower.
Yep.
And we'd probably have a pretty clean 200 horsepower too.
Yep.
And it should be lighter than an equivalent four-stroke. It should be.
And of course, it doesn't have all those exhaust pipes. Just has an exhaust manifold. When I borrowed a Canadian RZ500 Yamaha, I took the exhaust pipes off and weighed them. 4 exhaust pipes, 42 pounds.
Stock ones?
Now, that's the stock ones, yeah. That's the penalty for riding on the street, is that you've got to have all this stuff on your bike that's required for getting along with other people. Mufflers so that their eardrums aren't burst. Directional signals so the nice old lady won't say, "Oh, the young man, I didn't see him." And all these terrible stories. You have to defend yourself in traffic. Primary defense, of course, is your squirrel-like alertness.
Alertness and agility. Yeah.
Yes. Like all those people who are dismayed in flight school when the instructor cuts the power every damn time they take off. because the instructor wants you to have a strong reflex that is correct.
Yeah.
Because it is going to happen someday. So I'm afraid that we've drawn a picture of a rather boring engine.
No.
Torque everywhere. We
No,
don't
that's
want torque everywhere. We want torque, frightening torque that arrives like a freight train. But
it is a thrill, but it's hard to
yeah,
race. I mean, it's hard to race on that. That's the thing.
yeah.
Hard to race and hard to ride. And if you know, we could get, because my most recent racing experience is ARMA. You know, I was racing a 70 horsepower BMW R75/5, 750, 70 horsepower, beautiful torque curve. The XS 650 Yamaha is able to make similar horsepower. Now you can make more, but what do you lose? You lose the torque that gets you off the corner.
Yep.
And it would be more thrilling. It might even sound better because you could like kick the compression up some more, or you know, that cams can really make an engine. Well, we would say it sounds euphonious for some reason because we associate it with movement. That's why two strokes. Isn't that why two strokes sound good? We associate the sound of it with experiences.
Oh, of course.
And that's why it sounds good.
I went down to.
I made air quotes right now. Spotifyers. I did.
I went down to the area of the Mass Turnpike. One of my sons and I went to see the B-29 that was there for a while. And while we were there, a little pre-war twin went taxiing by. It had 985s on it, Pratt & Whitney 985s, and they have a Lopi idle that is just so confident and rhythmic and syncopated. It's delightful. And these sounds, these experiences, you greens, are unknown to you, and I'm sorry about it, but we all have our little pleasures in life. And these sounds were not only stirring, but filled with information.
Yeah.
You could learn something about how your engine was running by listening to it.
You reminded me when you talked about the twin 985s, wobble, 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 doing their thing.
Yeah.
I've flown on a B-17 and other twins, DC-3 or C-47 is actually what it was.
Yep.
And there's this magnificent, what is it? The RPM isn't perfectly equal, so you're doing 4 pushing balls to the wall, which is where that came from. The throttles go forward and they're ball shaped. That's where it came from. They're balls to the wall to get off the ground, and those 4 things go forward. And the RPM of the 4 engines is just ever so slightly different, and so you get this overlapping of sound waves, and you get that wah wah sound. The twins do it. I used to work in a psychiatric hospital. And I had a 1959 Austin Healey 106. So it was a 2.6 liter inline 6.
Yes, lovely car. Yes.
Nice running car, pretty kind of a wagon underneath, but inspirational wagon. And good sounding, great sounding car. And my friend Rob, who I was working with, also had an Austin Healey 3000. And we would leave together and we would go down the road side by side at midnight because we were doing 3 to 11. Shifts, and summertime in Southern California, top down at night, 75 degrees, wah 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 wah, because the RPMs are similar but different.
It
all of
created
those
a
sounds,
twin.
yeah, just everything, our memory, the smells, right? How powerful the smell is. I mean, if you went and smelled castor again, I mean, it's going to bring back a flood of feelings and memories.
Nothing like scent.
Yeah.
To trigger the mind.
So maybe we can get that out of our notional future two-stroke, is have a scent candle.
Well, I thought exhaust pipes were beautiful. Yeah. I made several sets of crossover pipes that were the right cylinder pipe went to the left side of the motorcycle and vice versa.
Why?
Because by curving around the other pipe, length was used up, such that the fat part of that pipe did not interfere with the drive chain.
Yes, got it.
That's why they did it that way. And it was really a head down, let's just get this done process to make it. But when the pipes were done and all the brackets were in place and they were on the motorbike, it was a very satisfying moment because the pipes looked nice, the welds looked good, the curves were as I had intended them to be.
It's nice.
And there's an aesthetic there. And of course, that's not coming back. Those beautiful exhaust pipes, particularly the titanium ones with all the colors, there's no purpose for them now, other than as at the Barber Museum when they started up Kenny's 1980 championship bike in the restoration shop, and it sounded like it should sound.
Oh, it's still happening in Arma, buddy.
Yes,
It may not be coming back, but it is not gone entirely.
no, it's not gone. Bits and pieces exist to this day.
Yeah.
I couldn't afford my own exhaust pipe, so I don't have any. Sometimes I felt like maybe I should make one, but then I wonder if I could. So, but that was an era, and it created a lot of powerful influence on the people who lived through it, and that's theirs. It can't be explained to people subsequently. It was very enjoyable at the time.
So if we got two strokes, then it isn't going to be the two-stroke that we're looking for in the classic sense. Because I think
it is not life rewound.
Because it's so. I think about the two-stroke enduros that I've ridden, your 300s especially, because the 300 two-stroke is so light, and they're making these big fat pipes, and you're getting it. You're getting bottom end. You're getting very significant, immediate torque.
Growly.
Really growly and just whoop. And it's wonderful. I don't think there's a better off-road engine than a 300cc two-stroke. But we're not getting that. We aren't getting that back on the street. I'm sorry. I didn't want the podcast to end this way. But we have to embrace what's coming. And I certainly, I would love to ride a motor like we've discussed, moderately more complicated than a standard two-stroke, significantly more powerful than a two-stroke or a four-stroke of the same displacement or even double.
Yep.
And could be darn efficient and very clean and give us results that are positively unreal.
Positively unreal. Yes.
One of those
forward to
non-statements, but yeah, that's so I guess I'll keep my RD and enjoy that periodically.
Fine weekends,
and that is a thrilling power band, I must say.
I have my TD1 for the same reason. I hope that I'll start it this next summer.
Great. Well, thanks for listening, folks. Another one in the books. We appreciate you taking the ride with us. Hit the comments. We always enjoy that. Episodes brought to you by Octane Lending. That's our parent company. You'll see a link in the description. You can click that link and go shopping for a motorcycle, get pre-qualified for a loan if you qualify, and go shopping, same as cash at your dealer and buy the bike of your dreams. It helps out. Click the link there. Anytime you listen, pay attention to our sponsors because they make this possible.
Yes.
So we really appreciate it. We'll catch you next time. Thank you.